Welcome to the Story Lab. Today, we will start a bigger project. We will try to adapt the Silmarillion. Of course, everybody would like to hear more about the world of Tolkien, and would like to see more movies set in that great universe. As long as they're good. With The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit both already having been turned into movie series, the next logical book to look to is the Silmarillion. We actually still have the entire Silmarillion to play with, and that book could give us not only one movie or one trilogy, but many projects. Today, we will try to make 5 movies out of the 5 great stories in the Silmarillion, starting with Beren and Luthien. This will only be part 1 of the project though. We will follow up on it with part 2 soon. So, what do we have in terms of great stories told in the Silmarillion? All of these stories play out during the first age of Tolkien's world, thus long before the events of Lord of the Rings, but there are still some stories that have more direct connections to the Lord of the Rings than others. We will now have to choose 5 out of the list. Let's quickly go through them. Morgoth's attack on the 2 trees of Valinor, the exile of the Noldor, and the colonization of Beleriand all are basically the backstory to the core events of the Silmarillion, which deal with the war of the elves in Beleriand against Morgoth and his armies. None of them will become one of our 5 movies. Instead, we're going straight to maybe the greatest of all of Tolkien's stories, Beren and Luthien. This story simply must be adapted, and it actually is so long that it is hard to make only one movie out of it. Next, we have the Nunaith Arno Eddidad, the Battle of 1,000 Tears. This great battle happens as a direct result of Beren and Luthien's adventure and the fact that they managed to trick Morgoth. As such, and because it introduces multiple new characters and influences all stories after it, the Nunaith Arno Eddidad would make for a great follow-up to Beren and Luthien. Next would be the story of Turin Turambar. However, this story is even longer than Beren and Luthien and covers nearly all of Turin's life. Furthermore, it takes place all over Beleriand, making it far more suited to a series format than a movie. Thus, we will have to skip it over. The story of Turin's cousin Tuor and his arrival in Gondolin can be told quite fast though, and doesn't even have to be its own movie. The story of the Norglemir and the fall of Thingol would again make for a great follow-up to the Beren and Luthien story, as its central theme is the Silmaril and the greed it causes. At least Beren also appears again in that story. A movie on the Norglemir could thus be a great end to the Beren and Luthien arc of the Silmarillion. Then the focus of the story switches from Doriath to Gondolin, and in terms of stories that have to be turned into movies, both Tuor and the Fall of Gondolin and Eärendil's Journey are absolute musts for adapting the Silmarillion. Of course, Eärendil's story was never written down by Tolkien, but a movie could easily also include the War of Roth into that story, thus giving us a nice round end for the First Age, and telling the end of the stories of all the characters. Speaking of characters, in general, the movies should be structured such that one doesn't lose track of all the different characters and places. Starting with the relatively contained story of Beren and Luthien, then expanding the character roster for Nunaith Arno Eddidad hopefully will accomplish this goal. Before we start planning out further, let's put down a golden rule for all of this. Unless really necessary for story reasons, do not change anything from the book, and try to not leave out too much. The only possible exception for changes will be to include something from Tolkien's later writings that would have changed a Silmarillion story as it had played out in the published book. So, here is the plan. We are going to construct 5 movies about 1. Beren and Luthien. 2. Hurin and Hua and the Nunaith Arno Eddidad. 3. The story of the Norglemir. 4. Tuor and the fall of Gondolin. And 5. Eärendil the Mariner. Beren and Luthien will tell the story of Beren and Luthien as a whole and should even work as a standalone movie too. This is a great place to start, because it doesn't need a lot of backstory beforehand, and we can actually use a framing device tying it to the Lord of the Rings. This can be, as it is in the books, a story that Aragorn tells to the hobbits while they journey together. As the story is quite long, squishing it a tiny bit should be okay. Hurin and Hua, Nunaith Arno Eddidad tells the story of the great battle, the betrayal of the Easterlings, that cost the elves the victory and much more. Hurin and Hua shall be the main characters for the story, not only because they are great human characters, but also because they can introduce us to Turgon by telling their story of living in Gondolin for a year as boys. This story also connects directly to Beren and Luthien, though only a few characters transfer from one story to the other. Naturally, there will be a lot of exposition in the story that has to be made interesting. This would work great if a few additional conflicts could be added to the story. The Norglemir story tells of Hurin's release after years of torture by Morgoth. It will tell the story of Thingol placing the Silmaril into the Norglemir, the dwarfs' betrayal and the subsequent battle between elves, dwarfs and with Beren's green elves. Through Hurin, this story ties into the end of the Nunnaith movie, but also brings back Beren, Doriath and all of that from the first movie. Also, this story should work also without the whole Turin story, which we have to skip. The fourth movie, Tuatha and the Fall of Gondolin, tells the Tuatha story, which is great in of itself and includes interesting characters, places, and battles. The story ties in with the previous ones by bringing back Turgon and Gondolin from movie 2. Also, this story's villain Maeglin also works without his backstory needing to have been told earlier. The greatest thing about this story is, though, how it perfectly sets up the great finale. That finale, of course, is Eärendil the Mariner. This story tells an adventure story of Eärendil as he travels across the sea, while also including his arrival at Valinor and the War of Wrath that follows. Ending with the War of Wrath will make this the great finale. In addition, the movie can have many endings, telling the end of the Silmarils and how Sauron would not return to face judgment, thus setting up the Lord of the Rings again. Okay, that was a lot of planning. Let's put all of those notes and all of that data into our supercomputer and see what he comes up with for these 5 movies. Movie 1 is completed. Let's have a look. Beren and Luthien. There is a framing device in that Aragorn is telling the story to the hobbits, while they are on Weathertop in The Lord of the Rings. Aragorn gives the setup that Morgoth lives in the north and has stolen the Silmarils from the Noldor elves, that they were fighting against him. It tells of Barahir helping Finrod during the Dagger Bragollach and how Doriath is a secret realm in the middle of Beleriand. Then Beren's story starts with him losing his father and companions. He then leaves for Beleriand. In a scene where he fights against giant spiders, we see this man's strength. The story then follows closely everything described in the Silmarillion. Beren enters Doriath and discovers Luthien. The two fall in love, but Luthien's father tasks Beren to get a Silmaril to win Luthien's hand. Beren leaves and seeks help in Nargothrond with Finrod. Finrod agrees to help, but they fail to get to Morgoth and instead end up in Sauron's tower. Meanwhile, Luthien is imprisoned by her father, but escapes to chase after Beren. Luthien is found by Celegorm and Curufin, who imprison her once more, but she breaks out with the help of the Hound Huan. Luthien then frees Beren, chasing Sauron away but arriving too late to save Finrod. At this point, the story will be shortened a bit by having Celegorm and Curufin appear again right after this battle, trying to grab Luthien. Beren will chase them away and subsequently, Beren and Luthien decide that they would continue the quest together. We thus return to a faithful retelling of the Silmarillion story with the two of them entering Angband and stealing a Silmaril from Morgoth. At the gates of Angband, Beren and Luthien get attacked by Carcharoth, who eats the Silmaril. Beren and Luthien are rescued by eagles though. Carcharoth invades Doriath and Beren and Luthien fight him. Beren dies and Luthien transfers her spirit to the halls of Mandos to get Beren back. In a beautiful final scene, Mandos grants her wish and Beren and Luthien find themselves returned to Doriath. At this point, the movie would probably already be very long. To streamline the ending a bit, it could be shortened by having Carcharoth directly mortally wound Beren at the gates of Angband, and dying from eating the Silmaril. The eagles could rescue Luthien and Beren's body, while she goes to Mandos to recover Beren with her beautiful song. The ending would be the two lovers reunited in Beleriand. That was a great story. Let's see what comes up next. Movie 2 is completed. Hurin and Hua. At the start of this movie, we get to know the rest of Beleriand and all the Noldor kingdoms, especially Fina's sons and Fingon the High King. The elves discuss Beren and Lúthien's adventure and decide to launch a large-scale attack against Morgoth. This is where we meet our protagonists, Hurin and Hua. Through their eyes, we see the preparations for the battle and get to know the plan. It is also at this point that Hurin and Hua's childhood adventure is mentioned, and we first hear about the hidden city of Gondolin. On the other side of Beleriand, we also meet some characters, namely the leaders of the men from the east. The two camps of humans are in fierce competition and do not trust one another. This is further amplified by Sauron appearing among them and seeding more chaos. Shortly thereafter, the battle begins. Most of the second act of the movie is the battle, however we do see very different fronts throughout, starting with the ill-fated first attacks in Fingon's camp. We witness the death of many elves on Fingon's side and Hurin and Hua leading the men, while the sons of Fina have not yet arrived. Just in the most precarious of moments for our protagonists, the Gondolin elves surprisingly arrive and help, only to themselves be driven back when dragons and bullrogs appear. Meanwhile, Fina's sons also spot the battle going on and attack as well, with them and the dwarfs taking on the dragons. The battle goes well until one of the human camps suddenly turns on the elves. We see the other humans kill the traitors, but it is too late and Fina's sons get overrun. This is when the second act of the movie ends. On the other side of the battlefield, Fingon is cornered by bullrogs and killed, but Hurin and Hua are still fighting, defending the Gondolin elves. The Gondolin elves flee and Hua gets killed, while Hurin gets captured. Hurin is brought before Morgoth but refuses to bow before him. And the elves of Gondolin also swear never to give up. What a great ending for such a war-heavy movie. But let's see what movie 3 is like, shall we? Thingol and the story of the Norglemere. We start the movie with Morgoth torturing Hurin, picking off where the previous movie ended, and Hurin seeing some impressions from the saga of his son. After this horrifying opening, Hurin is a broken man and is released by Morgoth. We follow Hurin as he tries to get into Gondolin and as he meets his wife for the final time. In the meantime, dwarfs arrive at Doriath and we see that everyone is happy with each other. Hurin then goes to Nargothrond and he kills Mim the little dwarf. We follow Hurin to Doriath where we see the scene in front of Thingol play out. Melian the Maya heals Hurin and Hurin leaves, with Thingol asking where he's going, but Melian just looking after him in silence. With that the first act is almost finished, we now see the beginning of work on the Norglemere to include the Silmaril. After a montage, Thingol heads down to the chambers, tries to take the Norglemere from the dwarfs and is killed. The dwarfs flee without the Norglemere, and the elves discover what had happened. Saddened, Melian goes away, leaving only Mablung behind to take care of the situation. During a calm moment in the movie, we see Mablung trying to plan everything out, but right then, the dwarfs attack and a battle happens. The elves cannot stop the attackers and all their treasure is stolen. Mablung hurries after the departing dwarfs but collapses from the pain of his wounds. This is when Hurin reappears. We switch scenes to see how an original female character left behind in Doriath, Mablung's wife for example, commands a guard to go and tell Beren and Lúthien about the attack. Then we see the guard ride off. The dwarfs are meanwhile approaching the river, but Hurin and Mablung call out to them to stop. The dwarfs turn around and laugh at the two broken men. However, another voice from behind warns them that they were not alone. And we see Beren again, standing in the river with his son at his side and Lúthien behind. Lúthien calls like a bird and 100 green elves appear as well. Another battle happens and this time the dwarfs are utterly beaten. Beren and Hurin fight on opposite sides and when the battle is over, they just acknowledge each other with a nod and depart. Hurin disappears into the mist, but we see Beren sink the treasure and giving the Silmaril to Lúthien. Dior, Beren's son meanwhile helps Mablung and offers to go back with him to Doriath to take the throne. Everyone agrees and so in the final scene, we witness Dior being made king of Doriath. And yet, far away we hear the distant rumbling that announces an army being prepared in Angband. For Gondolin not Doriath, but we do not know that. In the post-credit scene, Dior receives the Norglemir back and acknowledges his parents' passing. That movie leaves no doubt that the story isn't over yet. Luckily, movie 4 is already completed as well. Let's see what happens. Tuatha and the Fall of Gondolin. The first act of this movie will be the story of Tuatha and his arrival in Gondolin as told in Messages from Middle-earth. I.e. Tuatha grows up as a slave in Dorloaming but decides to leave and travels through the empty lands of Neverest, where he meets Ulmo the god of the sea and Voronway the elf from Gondolin. Ulmo tasks Tuatha to go to Gondolin and warn Turgon of the coming doom. Tuatha is led to Gondolin by Voronway and delivers the warning, but Turgon ignores it. There then needs to be a bit of a time jump to 7 years later, when Tuatha and Idril are married and Eärendil is a little boy. Maeglin is captured in the mountains and brought before Morgoth, forced to reveal the location and defenses of Gondolin. Maeglin is then returned to Gondolin. Meanwhile, Idril reveals to Tuatha that she had been working on the escape tunnel beneath their house and tells her husband that she fears the end of the city is near. Then, Morgoth begins his attack and the Battle of Gondolin begins. This part of the story will closely follow the untold original story that Tolkien wrote about the fall of Gondolin, including all the characters there such as Ecthelion. Though the elves do everything to defend their city, they are defeated and the only escape now is through Idril's tunnel. As the survivors escape, they are followed by a Balrog and Glorfindel has to fight it on top of the mountain, slaying it, while the elves look back on their fallen city with tears in their eyes. This story lacks a clear foe that they have to overcome, which is why it may make sense to expand Maeglin's role a bit. In the original story, Maeglin tries to capture Eärendil at one point during the battle. This could be expanded upon by not having Tuatha kill Maeglin right thereafter but having Maeglin be the one that tells the final Balrog where the tunnel ends and attacks alongside him, leading to a final duel on the pass, where Tuatha and Idril kill Maeglin, while Glorfindel is fighting the Balrog. Oh wow! Now the last movie is completed as well. Let's look at the great finale. Even before the title card, we already see a long scene, as the sons of Fëanor arrive at Doriath and demand the Silmaril. We hear Dior refuse and see the attack on Doriath. The title sequence plays out how this battle goes and how Elwing finally flees with the Silmaril, with the sons of Fëanor left behind. We get a time jump after Elwing has fled and see her and her people setting up camp at the mouth of the Surion. In the first scene, Tuatha and the survivors of Gondolin arrive. Elwing and the little Eärendil are introduced. We then go in a montage through the years that followed with Eärendil and Elwing growing up, starting to hold hands as Tuatha and Idril depart and finally being in love after a while when Eärendil builds his ship. By the time the talking scenes start again, Elwing has given birth to her sons and Gil-galad has arrived to welcome them. Gil-galad and Eärendil discuss Eärendil's upcoming mission to find Valinor and what that all might imply. We see Eärendil depart and go on an adventure that Tolkien sadly never spelled out for us, so this can be anything, probably a fight with the giant spider Ungoliant. Meanwhile, we also witness the renewed attack on the elves by the sons of Fëanor and how Elwing jumps into the sea flying over to Eärendil, just as he finishes his fun adventure. The rest of the story plays out very faithfully with Eärendil reaching Valinor and the Valar deciding to fight. In the final fight, we see Eärendil, the Valar, the humans, and the Valinor elves all fight and it is very impressive, but we also get to see how the story ends, with several final scenes playing out around the camp of the victorious army. We do not see Elrond and Elro's choices, as not much time seems to have passed in the movie, though we are not clear about that. But we do see how Maedhros and Magla steal the Silmarils and where they end up. We also get to see how Sauron pleads for forgiveness but is not given it. And the last scene is him going off into the dark becoming evil again. The framing story from the first movie could also be closed off here, with a last scene being Bilbo telling that story to Frodo as they drive to the Grey Heavens together, implying that Frodo has heard the entire history now, over the course of his own adventures. Well, you can certainly call this an exciting project. We have now created 5 Silmarillion movies telling some of the great stories of the First Age of Middle-earth as one great saga. But there is still more to do, so come back next time, when we shall do part 2 of this project. Please note that everything presented here is simply the results of an experiment. No part of this presentation is intended as a correction of an existing story or claims to be the real story. The selection or omission of any parts of the source material is not to be understood as commentary, positive or negative, on the original productions. These are simply thoughts and experiments based on existing material, and none of it could be created without the work of all those involved in creating the original works. As with any scientific result, you may utilize any of the story ideas that resulted from these experiments for your own experiments or production, while citing this experiment as its source. It is now closing time for our lab. Goodbye until next time.